In this video, I'm going to walk you through all the different techniques that you can do with vector shapes in Photoshop. So first of all, how do we draw with them? Well, the shape tools are here on the toolbar. You have a list of them, but let's just start with the first one, rectangle tool. Most of the techniques will apply to all the tools from this set, like the drawing modes, for example, which is the first and most important option you should select from the options bar. So here you can see we have shape, path, and pixels options. Now, if I choose pixels, for example, and I draw a shape, this will be actually added onto my layer. So if I make my thumbnails a bit bigger, you can see that that rectangle has been added onto the image itself. That is also useful, but that's not the way that you should normally work with vector shapes, because it's good to keep them as separate layers. So the option I prefer to use is the shape mode. If I select that and I draw a shape, now this will look different, and also it will be different in the layers panel. So it will become an editable vector shape layer. The advantage of vector shapes is that they are like type or text in Photoshop, that they are resolution independent, so you can resize them without losing quality, as long as you keep them vector shapes. And the way you can tell that a layer is a vector shape is that you look at the little thumbnail, and on the bottom right corner, if it has this icon, that means it is still a vector shape layer. Now, when you draw shapes, you will also get the properties panel popping up if you use Creative Cloud version or CS6. In previous versions, you wouldn't get this because there were no live shape properties for which we would need this panel. I will come back to this later, but first let me show you the last option out of the three, which is path mode. If I select that and I draw another rectangle somewhere here, let's say, you will see that this will become again different because this is vector shape, but it's not a shape layer. This is saved into the paths panel. If I switch to that, you will see this is called work path. The advantage of this is that it doesn't create anything visible, but you can then use it for all kinds of different things like selections or stroke the path with any of the other tools within Photoshop. I will talk about paths also in another video when we will deal with vector masks, but for now let's concentrate on the option called shape. There are two shortcuts which applies to all the different shape tools in Photoshop, which can add constraints to the shapes when you're drawing them. Holding down Shift will make it a perfect square in case you use the rectangle tool, and it would create a perfect circle if you use the ellipse tool. So the ellipse tool by default would draw ellipses, but as long as you hold down the Shift while drawing, you can create a perfect circle. Now the same thing if you hold down the Alt key, that will also change the way you draw. So let's say I want to add the circle within this square here. If I go in the middle and start drawing, you will see that the circle actually doesn't center within that shape, because by default you always draw from the top left corner. That's how you start drawing the shape. But if you hold down the Alt or Option key, then you can draw from the center point. So if you were accurately clicking in the center point, then this would create a perfect shape within the other shape. When you create shapes, to be able to select them later on, you will need to use the black arrow, which is called the Path Selection tool. So with this, you can select any of these shapes. And by the way, going back to our layers panel, you can see that now we have 4 shape layers. So if I select one of these shapes, I can move that around, and I can also select other shapes if I change the option here on the top to all layers. So the selection tool by default only allows you to select paths from your current vector shape layer, but if you choose all layers, then you can switch between layers with this tool as well. And that's the way I prefer to work with it. I can even make a marquee selection to select multiple shapes together and then interact with them. Let's say I wanted to change the color of one of these circles. So I have this one selected, and to change the fill or stroke colors, I can click either here in the options bar or also in the properties panel. So let's just change the fill color, for example. I'm going to pick a color that stands out from the background, and for the stroke color as well, I'm going to click on another color like that. I can also increase the size of the stroke, again either from here in the properties panel or from the options bar as well. We can find the same option. For the stroke itself, we have more options. We can change the alignment. By clicking on this option here, you can choose whether to have the stroke on the center of the outline, which is currently the way it is. We can choose to have it inside the outline or outside of that. So if I increase the size of the stroke, you might see this even better. This is how it looks when it's set to outside. This is how it looks when it's inside. And this is how it looks when it's centered. If I select the other shape, like this rectangle here, I can again increase the size of the stroke just so we can see it better what we are doing. And I'm going to switch to a different color again. So I can also change how the corners look by changing the joins. By default, this is how it looks, but we can change it to rounded corners. And we can also have the third option, which trims the corners. In case you create a bigger stroke size, you might be able to see this even better. And once again, it depends on where you align the stroke. If you align it to the outside, it will be even more visible, changing these join options. When you have a shape selected, which has corners, you can also adjust the corner radius. By click and dragging any of these icons in the live shape properties, you can adjust the corner size or radius. You can also unlink them. That way you can make individual changes. So you can create customized corner effects. But then of course you can reset the corners as well anytime to 0 to get your original square shape. You can also merge vector shape layers together. So let me just put these two shapes next to each other. Something like that, for example. Let's say I want to merge these two shapes together. So if I select both of them, then I can either press the shortcut Command E or go to the Layers panel and choose Merge Shapes. Once I do that, you will see that we will only see the outline of these two shapes because they became one vector shape layer, but it's still editable as two separate shapes. So I can move the circle around and you can see how it works. I can also select both of them together, of course, and I can move them together maybe up here. And we can, of course, change their attributes as well. Now, the attributes can only be changed together because they are one unified shape at the moment. You can also duplicate elements of a shape layer, like let's say we select the square and Alt-click or Option-click and drag will create the duplicate. So they're still within the same shape layer, but now it's duplicated. The same way you can unite shapes, you can also use them to subtract from each other. If you go to the path operations here in the properties panel, you can find the second option, which is subtract. So now you can see if I move this shape around, wherever I place it, it's going to subtract from the previous shapes. If I only want to subtract from the square but not the circle, I would have to move this shape behind the circle, which I can do by clicking on these options here on the top called Path Arrangement. And I just have to choose Send Shape Backward. Once it goes behind the circle, now it will only interact with the shape at the bottom, with the original square, and that way we can also create other interesting shapes. Once I decide that I don't need a path within a shape, I can just press backspace, but it will still keep the actual vector shape layer. The path operations to add, subtract, or even create intersection and exclusion can be also accessed from the options bar. So this is the list. And if you have a couple of shapes selected like these two, and you decide that you don't need them to be separate paths anymore, you can go to this option here and choose Merge Shape Components. That way, they will be finalized as a shape, so they can't be moved separately anymore. It will become permanently one unified path. For custom shapes like these, you won't have any options here in the properties panel, so this is not a live shape anymore. The live shape properties are only available on the default shapes that you can draw. Even if you rotate a square, it will become a custom shape, which will lose the live shape properties. Apart from aligning the stroke to inside, outside, and changing caps, you can also change the style of the stroke, so you can create dashed lines. Now this will show better if I switch back to the default options here. So I'm just going to reduce the size slightly, and you can see the dashed line on that shape. We can also choose other options like dotted lines, and you can create your custom dash line settings as well here, defining the length of dashes and gaps. And you can almost create like a pattern if you set this up, and of course you can save these custom settings. Now there's one thing to remember for the polygon tool, which is unique in that sense, that has an additional option called sides. So of course this decides how many sides you will get for the polygon that you are drawing. So if I just click and drag, by default it will draw 3 sides, but then I can also change the sides for future shapes. So I won't be able to change the sides on this one anymore, but I can type in 6 for the next shape, and if I draw that, you can see it will be a hexagon. So I can create a bigger hexagon, something like that, let's say, and you can see that's also going to be a separate shape layer. You can also see that Photoshop remembers the last use settings. So if I select, for example, this ellipse layer, which has the red fill and the yellow stroke around it, if I now draw another shape, it will copy the previously selected style. We also have the custom shape tool, which can create unique shapes. So here we can choose what type of shape we want to draw, and these are all the shapes you have in Photoshop by default. So here in the settings, you can choose which category you are looking for, or you can choose all and then add them to be able to select them. So let's just say I want to draw a crown. I just select that vector shape, and by click and dragging I can draw this, but remember to hold down shift if you want to keep the original proportions. To change the color of an already existing shape, the fill color, you can also sample from an image by using the eyedropper tool, which is this tool here. So if I click on any of these colors in the image, and then I press Alt backspace or Option backspace, that will fill in that color into the selected vector shape layer. So once again, I select another color, Alt backspace will add that color. The other way you can access this feature is by double clicking on the thumbnail of the vector shape layer and then click on a color to sample from it. This might be even easier, and you see in the background it automatically changes the color of my shape. Similarly to the path selection tool, we have another tool called direct selection tool, with which you can select portions of a design. So for example here, if I want to move some details around, I can select them. Like selecting the bottom 2 points of this path, I can then move them further down, for example, to extend that detail. Or I can even select individual points and move them around. If you want to draw something from scratch, probably the best tool for that is the pen tool, because with the pen tool you can draw, again, shapes or paths, but let's just stick to shapes. And by drawing shapes, you can click to define straight lines, or click and drag to define curved lines. And once you created a closed shape, you can also add fill colors to these shapes. So this is going to be definitely a completely custom shape. So let's try to draw this balloon in the background using the pen tool. Now this is not an easy tool to get used to, because it is quite tricky to decide where you place your anchor points. That's how we call in vector shape those little points that define shapes. So if I start drawing this one, let's say I just start drawing from somewhere here, I can do some parts with straight lines like that one, but then I can click and drag to define curved lines, and I'm going to just simplify this shape. So I just roughly go around it, But you can see I am drawing curved lines here until I get to the other side, where again I can use a straight line. So somewhere here I can use a straight line. And then for the little basket, we can even add just a square there, or we can continue down and then maybe create a little shape there just to indicate that there is a basket. Of course, it can be done much more precisely as well, but as an example, there we have our shape that we created, and this can be saved as a custom shape as well, so we can use it next time. So if I have this path selected, I can then go to the edit menu and choose define custom shape. Once I click on that, I can type in balloon, and then it will be accessible when I use my custom shape tool. From that list, we will find it right there at the bottom. Also, don't forget that from the Creative Cloud assets, you will be able to download shapes for Photoshop. So if I go into the options here, I can find vectors, which can be used in all the Adobe applications, and you can also use them as custom shapes in Photoshop. If you feel like drawing vector shapes in Photoshop is important for you, then have a look at my Essential Skills for Designers Mastering the Pen Tool course, in which I talk in great detail about all the settings and options you need to know about these tools. But now that we saw how to utilize Photoshop for drawing either with vector shapes or the brush tool, in the next video I will talk about transformations, which is crucial to know no matter what you are planning to do in Photoshop.